as some of you know, I was scheduled to speak to the BBC yesterday. In actual fact, Gary Muirhead did remember. Gary and everybody else, I kind of dropped the ball. The guy from the BBC kind of intimated that it was going to be an interview. So I condensed what I was planning to say down to about 4 or 5 sound bites that conveyed the frustration and the anger that I was experiencing and that the industry is experiencing with Didcot. Well, it turned out we ended up being on the telephone for about an hour because it's for a larger piece that he's actually in the process of putting together. So I spent a whole hour on the phone spouting forth about my personal thoughts on all things Didcot related, and I didn't have the presence of mind to actually press the record button because I have to say I was on pretty good form yesterday. I really did not. I didn't let the BBC guy have it both barrels because he works for the BBC and he had no role in the deaths of the 4 guys. But I certainly did make it very clear my frustration, I think the industry's frustration, and obviously the frustration of the families. And a couple of the points that I raised was, and it literally occurred to me on the fly. I've just been talking about my dad's funeral. My dad died on the 2nd of September this year. By the 9th of September, myself and my sister had a death certificate to confirm precisely how he died. It was no great surprise. He'd been suffering from COPD and cancer and various other bits and pieces. So as a result, that death certificate didn't bring any actual comfort, but it did bring a degree of closure. At least we knew what had finally shuffled him off this mortal coil. The families of the 4 men killed at Didcot have been, and I have to say, willfully denied that closure. I can't help thinking that this could have been brought to a conclusion an awful lot quicker had the correct resources been put in place. And one of the things, and this wasn't my suggestion, this was the guy from the BBC talking. He actually asked, how many people do you think are working on the investigation into the Didcot case on a daily basis? And my guess is probably none. You would think, bearing in mind that the structure collapsed and there was bits of bent and twisted steel, you would think that a proper forensic check would have indicated precisely what had happened on that day. They have apparently got thousands upon thousands of witness statements from people that worked there previously when the power station was still operational, people that were there on the day. They've spoken to me a couple of times. The thousands and thousands of statements. And my guess is by now, had they put the proper resources in place, we would have had an answer by now, instead of which we have none. And one of the points that I raised was, I was going to say good morning to Ken Hatcher. Morning, Ken. Good of you to join us. Thank you for being here on a Saturday morning. One of the points that I raised was if somebody had walked into Didcot Parkway train station carrying a big knife and he had gone berserk for a period and he had stabbed to death 4 people, there would have been a mass mobilisation of police resources. I don't know if we have all points bulletins here in the UK. I don't know whether I've just got that from American TV, but there would have been all points bulletins. There would have been rigorous searches to find the murder weapon. There would have been rigorous searches to find the perpetrator. That perpetrator would have been brought to justice. He would have been up before the beak, and all things being equal, he probably would have been now relaxing at Her Majesty's pleasure within a year or two. Why is it so different when it is an industrial accident? Why is the average pedestrian considered more important than a working man or a working woman? I can see it in your face, mate. The whole episode is a total shambles. There is something not right in all this waiting time for an answer. I'm glad you could see that, Mick. I woke up yesterday and I knew what I had to do yesterday. I had to go and see solicitors about probate. I had to go and arrange flowers for my dad's funeral. I had to meet with this commemorant to talk about orders of service. So, I woke up feeling, I knew I was in for a pretty tough day. But I also, I did yesterday's show and felt pretty good. And, by the time I jumped in the car to head off, I was feeling fairly chipper. But then that conversation with the guy from the BBC, just, I don't know, it just brought it all home. And what a fantastic point. To put things in perspective, the police spent 3,200 hours investigating whether the most boring man alive broke the rules over a curry after the tabloids pressured them long enough to start one. Yeah. And again, there was lots of stuff that came up yesterday. I don't know if anybody remembers, but in the immediate aftermath, I think the day after Didcot happened, it was mentioned in the House of Commons. I think it was mentioned once or twice after that. The local MP for Didcot, frankly, has been the best part of useless. I've contacted him, and I know other people have contacted him. He's reached out to the Thames Valley Police and the Health and Safety Executive. They come back and tell him exactly the same as they tell everybody else. The investigation is ongoing. And that's it. Apparently, the BBC had actually reached out as part of this show or program that they're planning, which is why I was being interviewed. And he said, "Oh, I've got nothing new to add." Wasn't particularly interested. There is an MP up in Rotherham, which is where one or two of the guys that were killed were actually based. A lady called Sarah Champion. She has offered a couple of sound bites over the time, but call me a cynic, but it was almost like she was using the opportunity to make her presence felt. But as Al has just said, you can spend 3,000 hours, and we would have been talking multiple police forces, multiple police officers to investigate that, and yet there are 4 families who waved goodbye to their loved ones one morning back in February 2016, and they still don't know to this day what happened. Another point that I raised, have we had any joy? Let me just answer that one. We've had an answer, but the answer is pretty much the answer that they give to, just to let you know, the police send a regular, I think it's twice yearly, update to the families. And the update reads something along the lines of, our thoughts and prayers with the families of the men that were killed. The investigation remains ongoing. We are considering prosecuting under manslaughter by negligence and all of those sort of things. But they've been saying that now for 6 3/4 years. We get another update which will say exactly the same thing with each passing anniversary. So by the time February rolls around, you can honestly expect to see that trotted out again. Mick says, I had the pleasure of knowing the 4. Only managed to attend John's funeral. As you know, I've been very scathing the whole episode, and to be honest, I have no faith in the police nor the HSE now. I'm not going to name names, but I know of at least 2, and I've heard a third, but I can't confirm that one, but I know of at least 2 people very respected people within the industry who had been approached to be expert witnesses for the Health and Safety Executive in the investigation into Didcot, and both had declined because they had no faith in the HSE's ability to deliver a proper and thorough investigation, which tells you all you need to know. Another point that was raised yesterday, and I think I probably mentioned this on the show, is the fact that there is a very real danger now that Didcot will set a precedent. When I was summoned by the fine folks at Sky TV, I got a phone call the evening that Didcot actually happened, and they asked me to be up at Didcot the following morning to give my expert opinion. I've never knocked anything down in my life, but they asked me, so I trotted along. And it was only a few weeks previous to that the HSE had publicly stated that they were taking roughly 4 years to investigate a fatal industrial accident. So I went on to Sky TV armed with that information, and said, it was tragic, and thoughts with the fact you say all the things that you need to say, and don't want to say anything about the demolition process, because at this moment in time we don't know, and we still don't know. But I actually said on Sky TV and on the BBC and on ITV and various other shows as well that I would have expected to have seen some sort of closure and prosecution by the year 2020. 2020 obviously came and went, 21 came and went, 2022 looks like it's going to go as well, and we still have no answer. Now, there are a couple of others. We've mentioned earlier this week, it was the 3rd anniversary of the accident in which 2 guys were killed in very horrific circumstances up at Teesworks in Redcar. That's 3 years. I would imagine by now the families of the 2 guys killed at Redcar are now looking at the experience that the families of Didcot suffered and thinking, we've probably got at least another 4 years to wait before we get an answer. At least another 4. There was another one as well. And funnily enough, the guy from the BBC was familiar with it because it was something he'd reported on in the past as well. I don't know if you remember, but up in Birmingham, there was a collapse of a wall at a scrapyard, and there were 4 migrant African origin workers who were stood behind the wall, and by all accounts a lot of scrap had been piled up against the wall, and eventually, much like the Aberfan disaster, if anyone remembers that, the sheer weight of the scrap that had been piled against the wall caused the wall to collapse. It collapsed on the 4 men. The 4 men were crushed and killed. That happened about 6 months after Didcot, and those families too have had no answers whatsoever either. So it honestly does now feel like the HSE has shifted the goalposts. What was 4 years is now 7 or almost 7 and counting. Which is going to be of enormous concern to anybody who sees their loved ones killed. You'd have to think so, wouldn't you? Is this another attack on workers' rights by stealth? As I said at the outset, if somebody had run amok with a knife or a machete and killed 4 people in the street, my guess is they would probably be in custody by that night. They would be remanded in custody within a day or 2, and they would be prosecuted within a year and banged up, probably undeservedly, for life. Why is that different? Why is that any different? To draw out that comparison, we must have some sort of smoking gun, a murder weapon in terms of the power station boiler house that collapsed. Good morning to Mick Norton, who's just joined us. Good of you to join us, Mick. And we're talking all things Didcot, which I know is a subject very close to your heart. So yes, my concern is that this could set a precedent. There was another point as well that I raised, and I've raised it here previously as well, is why are we so poor at this as a nation? So back in, I'm trying to remember, I think the year 2020, there was a power station in Ohio called the Killen Power Station, which is hardly ironic at all. Boiler house there collapsed. 3 men were declared missing. Turns out that one of them was actually injured, but he was okay, and 2 were killed. Here in the UK, because the Health and Safety Executive and Thames Valley Police threw a cordon around Didcot, it would be almost 7 months before the bodies of the 4 men, or 3 of the 4 men were killed. Mick Collins was recovered within a day or 2. But it took nearly 7 months to recover 3 bodies. In Ohio, it took less than a month, even though they too were dealing with an unstable structure, but it took less than a month. The incident over in Ohio was investigated, prosecuted, and the case was closed within 18 months. Here in the UK, Very similar set of circumstances, and we are almost 7 years in. Now, if somebody can explain to me how that makes any sense, bearing in mind, one of the things that I said to the BBC, and this is a real firm belief with me now, is from the very moment that the dust cleared after that boiler house had collapsed, I sensed that the health and safety executive, I wouldn't go so far as to say they were rubbing their hands together, but their primary focus seemed to be securing a successful prosecution. Never mind the feelings and grief of the families, never mind the lessons that the demolition industry might have learned, never mind leaving bodies undiscovered for nearly 7 months, never mind having to take down the remainder of the building using explosives with those bodies still in place. So long as they secured their successful prosecution, that seemed to be their primary aim. And yet you look at the US, the home of the ambulance chasing legal system, highly litigious nation, highly litigious legal system. You would have thought that if anyone was going to drag things out and focus primarily on securing a prosecution, it would have been the Americans. Instead of which, the Americans saw the building come down, or the Killen power station boiler house come down. They got the guys out in a couple of weeks, and within 18 months, the whole thing was cut and dried, closed. Fines were handed down, and so on down the line. How is that possible on the other side of the pond and not possible here? I just don't. I don't get it. And another point that I raised, as I say, I really do regret not having recorded this. It wasn't possible, and I certainly didn't expect the conversation to be as broad and as detailed as it was. I was going somewhere with that. What was I saying? You see, this is why I have a script for the Breakfast show. I had something on the tip of my tongue then. No, it'll come back to me, I'm sure. But it is just an ongoing source of frustration. And while I've tried to vent my anger, I don't know. I didn't actually see the outcome, but apparently there was an Institute of Demolition Engineers seminar taking place in London yesterday. I don't do them anymore. I don't do NFDC events. I don't do IDE events. The NFDC has long since ceased inviting me to things. I understand that, and not that I would attend anyway, but all the while that the CMA investigation is playing out and no action is being taken, I've just decided to boycott the whole thing. But there was an HSE representative scheduled to be at the IDE seminar yesterday, and I wonder if anybody actually took the time to put them on the spot and ask them some very, very serious questions. I know what I was going to say. It's just come back to me. My fear now is that even if an MP, and I don't expect it because that's not what MPs are concentrating on, but even if an MP were to stand up in the House of Commons on Monday and raise merry hell about the fact that it's been almost 7 years of the Didcot investigation, the Health and Safety Executive and Thames Valley Police, to a degree, have a bit of a get out of jail card in COVID. They can point to the fact that they and the rest of us lost 2.5 years due to pandemics and lockdowns and furloughs and Lord alone knows what else. Which, if I were in their position, if I'd been dragging my heels for 7 years, I'm sure I would reach for the same excuses. But even if you allow for that, that still means that investigation has taken 5 years. Never mind COVID, 5 years. I said it at the very top of the introduction. Probably within 6 days, I knew precisely how my father had died. There are 4 families there that don't know that, and it's little things. There was one of the guys, Ken Cresswell. His daughter was scheduled to get married. He never got to walk her down the aisle. I was going to say, trust me, it is the proudest day in a man's life. I don't know, because neither of my daughters are actually married yet. Maybe one day. But, that is a key part, and when you get married, you are expected, father expects to be walking daughter down the aisle, handing her over to hopefully a decent husband and everything else. And Sadie Cresswell was robbed of that. Ken will never get to see any grandchildren come along, and so on down the line. That's the true human cost. And I kept on trying to reiterate that with the guy from the BBC yesterday. Yes, I would have loved some answers about the engineering background to the collapse. Was it caused by some sort of design fault? Was something cut or burned that shouldn't have been? Was the building unstable? Was the fact that it was a hung boiler? Did the boiler kick to one side and cause that? We don't know. We genuinely don't know. But all of that is secondary to the feelings of the families, to give them some sort of closure and some sort of reassurance. Even something like the findings of the investigation, to be able to say that the 4 men were killed instantly, rather than they were killed, and our fear is that 1, 2, or 3 of them basically laid there undiscovered in pain. We don't know. We don't know, and that must be a terrible thing to live with. And I keep coming back to this idea of there must be some way to separate cause and prosecution. If the HSE by now had come back and said, our investigation has revealed that the cause of the accident was this, whatever this is, that was the cause. All of the machinations around who was responsible for that thing that caused the collapse, that can wait. But at least you'd be able to go back and say to the families and possibly say to the industry, that is what caused that collapse. And those that have watched this show and their other shows for any length of time will know that I had an interview with a guy called Joe Vendetti, based over in the States, demolition expert himself, and he had predicted, based on the number of power stations to come down around the world, based on the health and safety track record in the UK, in the US, in Canada, he reckoned that we could be looking at another 150 demolition deaths before we've got rid of all of the fossil-fueled power stations. I've mentioned a couple that have died in Ohio. We obviously lost 4 here. We lost another one up at Lungannet, up in Scotland as well. And all of that might, as it turns out, it hasn't, but it might have been impacted. If the HSE had revealed the findings, it might have changed the way in which subsequent power stations were taken down. Coleman and Company themselves, the company that were carrying out the demolition, have almost immediately after, they've carried out an audit of the working practices, and they believe they have discovered a flaw in the accepted methodology used to take down these power stations. But they've been prevented from releasing those details lest it prejudice any subsequent court case. How mad is that? Knowing full well that there are dozens, in fact hundreds, something like 1,500 worldwide fossil fuel power stations to come down, and locked in a little drawer somewhere within the Health and Safety Executive in its sanctum is possibly the key to safeguard the lives of others. And I mentioned this to the BBC reporter or researcher yesterday. I don't think, despite the fact that Didcot has fallen off the front pages of the newspapers, despite the fact that it's not been on the TV news outside of the anniversaries of the event, I don't think anybody realises just how far-reaching all of this was. I've been quizzed about this in ConExpo 2020 over in the States, and the one that I found most striking was when I was in Japan in 2019. arrived at a Caterpillar factory, and there were two things. I was greeted with, "Oh, you're that bloke off of Instagram," and I admitted, yes, I was the bloke off of Instagram, even though I'd done an awful lot before Instagram came along. And then the next question was, "Is there any update on Didcot?" That's in Japan. That's in Japan, where, I mean, they obviously have power stations, but hand on heart, it is one of the most advanced demolition industries in the world, and they wanted to know, because there was not morbid interest, but genuine interest. Was there something within the Didcot investigation, within the Coleman and Company audit, that they could take away and use to safeguard their people? And I could tell them nothing. Is the BBC planning a 30-minute or an hour documentary? Not at the moment. There was some talk about, ultimately a documentary, but a documentary to a degree kind of needs a resolution. So I would imagine, all of this, I do the same. The unseen part of journalism is I've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of documents and bits of paper and electronic paper relating to Didcot, much the same as I've had with the CMA investigation. So when somebody finally stands up and says, "These are our findings, this is who we believe is responsible, this is the prosecution," at that point I would imagine the BBC may well do something, because they've been following it. And I criticise, I think there's a lot of criticism levelled against the BBC and the media, particularly in the past few years. But while the other major news outlets, including TV, radio, newspapers, have largely forgotten Didcot, the BBC have stuck with it. So I have to say hats off to them for that. So yes, that may be the case. The guy I was speaking to yesterday actually kind of hovers between various bits and pieces. He is with BBC's Southeast bit. So he does a bit for online, a bit for radio, and a bit for TV. And the way that the BBC syndication works, just so you're aware, is you often speak to give you an example, when in the immediate aftermath of Didcot, I spoke to BBC in Oxford. It's their nearest station, and the national BBC picked up on that, and then they contacted me, and as a result of that, BBC Surrey, because that's where I live, they contacted me, and so it goes on. So BBC South East are looking at doing something. I think they were initially looking to do something purely online, but based on the conversation yesterday and just how long it went on, I think there's more to it than that. And my closing remark to the guy was, I'd want to keep it in the public eye. If you want me on a show, if you want me to help do a show, even if you just want me to feed you all the information that I've ever gathered on the inquest and the inquiry, I'll hand it over willingly. Basically, to try and put some pressure on the powers that be to pull the whole thing together. I'm going to come to Mick Norton's comment in a second, because it kind of follows on from the point that I was discussing with the guy from the BBC. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the comic book movie, well, the comic book and the movie based on the comic book, The Watchmen. It's about a team of superheroes, which seems like a weird tangent. But the team of superheroes they have some flaws, and there is this expression within the film, who watches the Watchmen? And I would say, who watches the police? Who polices the police? Who do we turn to in order to bring to shed light on the intransigence of both the Thames Valley Police and the Health and Safety Executive, which is where our friend Mick Norton comes in. Is it not time for a public inquiry? Reference police primacy for the Didcot work-related death protocol reveals, in the case of some incidents, particularly those involving multiple fatalities, HSE may, with the consent of the Secretary of State, direct a public inquiry be held. Alternatively, the HSE board may authorise HSE or any other person to investigate and produce a special report. Mick is our expert in all these things. I wasn't aware of that, and maybe that becomes my next line of attack. You know, I've made no secret of the fact I've spoken to trying to remember the guy's name. Is it David Johnston? David Johnston, something like that. I've spoken to the MP for Didcot. I've spoken to Sarah Champion up in Rotherham. She had a couple. It was a couple of her constituents that were actually killed in the event. I've spoken to my local MP, Chris Grayling, because I know him, and I've got nowhere. So maybe the Secretary of State is my next port of call. And thank you very much indeed, Mick, for supplying me with the link. I'll take a look at that after the show. Sorry to say, when it first made news, all and everyone was on the case. Now it's hardly mentioned by the mainstream, saying they will be all over it again when and if the result comes. Yeah, it was in the nicest possible way. It was like a feeding frenzy at Didcot the day after. I don't know what I expected, to be honest, because I've never done it before. And listen, I was one of the people that was brought to the place, so I'm equally guilty of what I'm about to explain. But I guess in my head, I was going. It was just going to be me, a Sky TV cameraman, and a Sky TV reporter. And when I arrived, it's not there. They've changed the road layout, but the road that used to lead to the cooling towers and the main entrance to the power station was literally lined with media trucks. And I'll come back to that part in a second. But there were lots and lots of people, very sadly, I think, using the incident to seize their 15 minutes of fame. There were, I was stood literally 10 foot away from a guy who I think he lived locally, and he was on a national TV station. I'm not sure which one it was, but literally saying, "Oh, I worked there for years, and this is an accident that's been waiting to happen. It was all mismanaged, and the demolition was long overdue." And whoever the TV reporter was absolutely lapping it up. And the guy may well have worked at the power station. He may well have swept the floor of the power station. What made him an expert? What made him some sort of structural engineer or demolition engineer? Nothing whatsoever. But they use that to seize their moment in the spotlight, which unfortunately that seems to be very much the way of the world these days. Also gave me a bit of an insight. I said I'd come back to this, but it also gave me a bit of an insight into the way that the media works. As I say, I was invited up there by Sky TV, did my piece with the reporter, and as far as I was concerned, my work here is done. I've done what I was asked to do. So preparing to get back in my car, and a young lady came up and said, "Excuse me, I hope you don't mind me asking, but who are you?" I said, "Mark Anthony, I'm from Demolition News." "Oh, Demolition News, you must know about demolition. I'm from the BBC. Can you come and talk to our cameras?" "Okay, I'll do that." Did the bit with the BBC. Literally finished that, and somebody else came up and said, "I'm from ITV. You clearly know what you're talking about. Can you come and talk to us?" And that was the thoroughness that was in place on that day. As I say, that might be unique because I don't get to do this very often, thankfully. There was another point that I made about the whole Didcot thing. I've been doing this job for 3 decades now. I've written about demolition and diggers and various other bits and pieces over the years. And at no point did I think that a single story would end up defining my career. And yet it has. Funnily enough, I have a friend who has a friend within the BBC, and he actually asked the question, how do you go about finding people to talk on TV shows and radio shows and stuff? And the guy said, "Well, we have a list of go-tos." And the guy, who is a demolition guy, said, if something happened, demolition related, who would you speak to?" And the guy literally went to his computer, tapped a few buttons, and he went, "There's a bloke called Mark Anthony at Demolition News. He's our go-to." I'm just a journalist, but because of Didcot, or primarily because of Didcot, I have become demolition's go-to guy. Crazy. You know, there are people that are far, far more knowledgeable, far better equipped to comment on these kind of things. Some of whom I understand probably didn't want to in the aftermath of Didcot. You'd have to think that somebody from the National Federation of Demolition Engineers or somebody from the Institute of Demolition Engineers would have been a better choice. But given that Coleman and Company were a member of both organisations, I would imagine that even if they had been approached, and as far as I know they weren't, but even if they had been approached, I would imagine they would have taken a very quick and decisive step backwards and left it to somebody else. Mick Norton makes a good point, but I suspect the HSE has already started an inquiry by an independent entity. They work in a strange way, believe me. Yeah, I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do. But, and again, I mean, doesn't that beg a question in itself? Going back to my Who Watches the Watchmen, the HSE, although the Thames Valley Police have primacy at the moment, or that is my understanding, the Health and Safety Executive have been on this from the day it happened. Do we want the HSE to call an inquiry into the HSE? This is not dissimilar to Donald Trump hand-picking the judges that decide whether or not he should be impeached. It's not dissimilar to Boris Johnson hand-picking the team responsible for investigating Partygate and so on down the line. You know, if we're going to have an inquiry, let's make it a proper independent inquiry. And if that inquiry is to take in the police from Thames Valley, then let's have somebody from the Metropolitan Police or Yorkshire Police or Greater Manchester Police take care of it, you know, rather than Thames Valley Police investigating themselves. Let's make it truly independent. But again, we've got to get over that first hurdle first. And because it is for working men, I don't believe there is an appetite for pursuing an inquiry, for trying to bring a more timely conclusion to the investigation that's already ongoing. I'm almost at the point now where I'm starting to believe that the Health and Safety Executive and Thames Valley Police would be much, much happier if we could all just forget about it and they could just quietly let it dwindle. And it all goes back to the point that I made earlier. According to the last statement that the police and everybody else issued, you know, they've got tens of thousands of pieces of evidence, thousands of pages of eyewitness statements. What's happening with those? Is there a man or a woman pouring through that on a daily basis? Is there a team pouring through that on a daily basis? My guess is not. Have they actually identified a piece of evidence, be it a piece of metal or an eyewitness that has said, there you are, that thing there, that's what caused it, and that's why 4 men died? Has that happened yet after nearly 7 years? If it hasn't, what the hell have you been playing at? If it has, what the hell are you playing at? Not bringing it to prosecution and not bringing it to public attention. Yeah, that's unfortunately it. The victims don't matter enough. Would we still be talking about this in the same way if 4 MPs had been killed in a building collapse? Would we still be talking about this in the same way if 4 bankers or barristers had been killed in a single incident? My guess is no, we would not. That would have been over and done with. Resources, both financial and human, would have been allocated and the whole thing would have been brought to a close in fairly short order. But because we are talking here about working men, and it is men in this instance, as Alice just said, they don't matter enough. And I mentioned the collapse of the scrapyard up in Birmingham, which would have been about, I think it was like June, July 2016, where the 4 guys were killed there. And I'm going to couch this as best I can, because I actually think what they did was very, very sensible. The families of the 4 guys that have been killed have waited and waited and waited, much the same as the families at Didcot have waited and waited. And they eventually, and justifiably in my opinion, played the race card. I think that's often used as a negative. They're playing the race card to get a council house or get a leg up with something or other. In this instance, I think partly it was born of frustration, but I would honestly wonder if that was born out of some sort of fact as well. Were the resources put in place to investigate the death of 4 African workers? And would those same resources have been allocated were those people white and middle class? And again, all of the guys that were killed at Didcot were white, but what if they had been middle class? What if they'd been upper class? What if they'd been members of the aristocracy? Would we still be talking about this 7 years later? No, we wouldn't. And I always have to be very careful with this, because please bear in mind, yes, I do politically, I lean more to the left than I do to the right. I'd make no bones about it. I work in media, that's just part of the deal. But I am a man I've been a member of 2 unions, and I've quit both of them in my time, and I'm going back a long, long way. I never really had a great deal of faith in unions. I probably still don't. But when you see things like this, who out there is going to speak up for the working men? The 4 working men that were killed at Didcot, the 4 working men who were killed at the scrapyard in Birmingham, the 2 working men that were killed at Teesworks in Redcar. Who is going to speak up for them? As far as I know, nobody is. And I think one of the other things that struck me about, probably more about Teesworks, although having been back to Didcot, I think the same thing applies. If you go to Didcot now, I've already mentioned the road layout there is somewhat different. There are houses being built. Apparently there's a new data centre going in there as well. I'm fairly sure there's a new school being built. All of which is fine. That's progress. The power station had reached the end of its, not its working life, but certainly its environmental life. That was why it was coming down. But the owners of the power station, RWE, and whoever the house builder and the school builder and the data centre builder, whoever they are, will have made a tidy profit out of that piece of land where 4 people died. When you look at Redcar even more specifically, Teesworks is one of, if not the biggest demolition projects, certainly in the UK and quite possibly in Europe as well. It's absolutely vast. All the talk now from Ben Houchin, the local mayor up there, all of the talk now is about job creation and gigafactories and Freeport status and all of those things. And all of that is being built on the unmarked graves of 2 men who died in horrific circumstances, and we still don't know why, and we still don't know how. I'm not for one moment suggesting that we should halt progress until the investigation has taken place. I live in the real world. I know that's not realistic. But that Teesworks facility will generate billions of pounds. How much is being spent on the investigation into the death of the two guys? My guess is not a great deal. And even if it's not a great deal, this was a point from the guy from the BBC. An investigation at Didcot that's taken almost 7 years. How much has that cost? $1 million? 2 million? 10 million? Who knows? And would it not have been more cost effective? You know, and I hate to dwell on the subject of finance when we're talking about the loss of 4 lives, but would it not have been more cost effective to have thrown as much resource as you could at it in the initial stages, you know, while it was all fresh in everyone's memory, and, you know, the eyewitnesses will have remembered exactly what they had for breakfast on the day of the accident, and so on down the line? Would that not have made more sense rather than dragging the thing out for nearly 7 years? Dan Culler's just joined us. Morning, Dan. Mick said, let's be honest here, Mark, as long as you are right and all that are listening have a hole in our collective asses, we'll never know the truth. If we do get an answer, it will be distorted in one way or another. Yeah, I fear it might. I fear it might. I have a bugbear in terms of accidents in general, but fatal accidents in particular when it comes to demolition. I never feel like the role of the client is investigated as fully as it should be. I have a lot of respect for Coleman & Company as a demolition company. They've done some fantastic work. I've been on some of their sites. I've been to Didcot to see Coleman & Company doing their thing. But were they the right company for the job? They readily admitted in the immediate aftermath that they'd never taken down a power station before. So there's a question that needs to be answered. And on that basis, given that they hadn't done a power station before, how did they get through the approval process? How did they get through the tender process? When, you know, you don't need to be a rocket scientist. If somebody said to anybody in the UK demolition industry, we are about to take down a power station, guess who is doing the job? I guess first guess would probably be Brown and Mason. Second guess might be Erith. Third guess might be McGee's or Keltbray. It wouldn't be Coleman & Company. As I say, I have to state very, very categorically, I've been on Coleman demolition sites and they're very good, but they've never done a power station before. So, coming back to RWE, they let the demolition contract. Was it because Coleman gave them a very convincing case that despite having never done it before, they could do a perfectly adequate job? Were they the cheapest? Were they going to be the quickest? What was it that made RWE choose Coleman & Company? And if it transpires, and I hope it doesn't, in my heart of hearts, I would like nothing more than the HSE investigation to say, actually, we've identified an intrinsic fault in the design and construction of the power station, and those 4 guys died tragically, but the fault that actually caused the collapse was built into it 40 years ago, and it was unforeseeable. That would be my ideal outcome. That's not what I expect, but that would be my ideal outcome. But if it does turn out that it is the demolition contractor, either the contractor itself or an employee within Coleman & Company that is left to carry the can, do RWE just walk away? You know, despite the fact that they appointed them, they must have chosen them. Do they just walk away? And bearing in mind, I won't mention details of the cases, but think about Michael Jackson's court cases. Think about O.J. Simpson's court cases. Think about Prince Andrew's court cases. We know full well that the more money you've got, the more chance you've got to get enough. If it turns out that there is fault on the part of both client and demolition contractor at Didcot or at Redcar, who do you think is going to carry the can? Do you think it's going to be the family-owned demolition company or the multinational, multi-billion-pound energy company? It comes back to the old question: is the HSE fit for purpose, or does it need a complete overhaul? It, like the CITB, needs a complete overhaul. But there is, I think there's a bit of a double whammy. I don't think, I think more so with the CITB, I think there's that fear of the unknown. You know, better the devil you know, let's just try and soldier on with what we've got. So I think that's part of the deal. But in order for a health and safety executive Mark II to actually be able to do the job in the way that it should be done, is going to require an awful lot of money, an awful lot of new inspectors. And unfortunately, the funding, despite the fee for intervention and the very fact that they are basically a profit centre of their own, it's not a vote winner. I can't imagine any politician standing up and saying, I want £1 billion to improve the health and safety executive. And I tend to take a very narrow focus on these things. I tend to report on accidents and fatalities within demolition and construction. In the grand scheme of things, demolition and construction are pretty damn safe. We lose somewhere between 30 and 40 workers each year on our sites, which is 30 or 40 too many. But compare that to agricultural, the fishing industry and mining industry and stuff. By and large, we're not too bad. But if it's taking the health and safety executive 7 years to investigate a fatal or a multiply fatal accident here in demolition, what's happening in farming? What's happening in agriculture? What's happening in the fishing industry, the forestry industry, the quarrying industry, the mining industry? My guess is they're all facing the same thing. And again, there is that belief that of divide and conquer. I think if we could arrange a meeting that got all the heads of and I mean the proper heads, not trade associations, but the proper heads of the agricultural industry, with the quarrying industry, the mining industry, construction industry, put them all in the same room, I think they would all agree that the HSE was not fit for purpose and it needed a complete overhaul. But instead of which, we're all allocated our little inspectors. We had this the other day, where this is a CITB thing, the NFDC, God bless them, had decided, rightly, they saw our show, they reported a competence card scam, pointed it out to the CITB. It took them 17 days to respond, and part of their response was, we're aware of the fact that these scams are here today and gone tomorrow. Well, if you know that how fast moving the criminals are with bogus and spurious competence cards, why is it taking 2.5 weeks to respond to an email? And unfortunately, we have the same thing with the HSE. The guy that spoke, or I'm assuming it's a guy, perhaps wrongly, but the person that spoke at the Institute of Demolition Engineers event yesterday is probably, he has been allocated demolition and construction. And if anybody within this industry wants to get above him or her, they would struggle to do so. Let's have a look. So true. Sometimes it's the client has no knowledge of some jobs at hand and probably down to price. Yeah, and bizarrely, one of the worst culprits for this is anyone that's actually spending the public money. We all often hear about the way that demolition contracts are weighted. So, they have to weigh competence against experience, against time scale, against methodology, and ultimately against price. But how often do all of those other factors outweigh price? You know, and even when somebody has bought, I mentioned this to the example I gave to the BBC guy was, imagine that you have inherited a house. It's on a plot of land, and that plot of land, the house is not great, but the plot of land is very valuable and could probably take another 3 or 4 homes. So you reach out to your local demolition fraternity and you ask for a price to take down the house that currently sits there. And the first bid comes back at £100,000, and the second bid comes out at £105,000, and then the third one comes out at £25,000. Temptation obviously is, and unfortunately this is precisely the way it works, somebody will say, oh, 25,000 quid, what a saving, I'll take that, thank you very much. So imagine you do that and you take on the demolition contractor that's agreed to do a £100,000 job for 25 grand. What corners is he going to cut? Is he going to be using experienced people? Probably not. Is he going to be using the right equipment? Probably not. Is the equipment that he's using up to scratch? Probably not. Have the people been trained? Probably not. Have they been through health and safety training? Probably not. As a result of all of those things, that house that they're demolishing falls down and kills a guy. An investigation ensues. The investigation finds that the demolition contractor was not fit for purpose. His workers were not trained, not qualified, blah, 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 blah. The equipment was out of date, hadn't been serviced properly, and so on down the line. And the demolition contractor is going to be prosecuted and fined. What about you? What about the fact that you have knowingly, you know, you've been told by 2 experienced demolition companies that to take down that building is going to cost you 100 grand, but you've decided to get it done for 25 grand? You are indirectly responsible for the death of that person, are you not? Surely you are. You know, your purchasing decision, based primarily on price, has indirectly resulted in the death of a demolition worker. Surely you should be held at least partly accountable for that. That's a good question. Is it politically desirable to have an HSE which is fit for purpose? I don't think it's desirable or undesirable. I just don't think there is the will there. You know, if, despite the fact that I'm fairly sure it was David Cameron that mentioned Didcot in the House of Commons, but even if, you know, on Monday morning we awake to find that the Health and Safety Executive have completed their investigation, they know exactly what the cause was, and they know who is responsible, they're about to prosecute, and everything's going to be hunky-dory. Is an MP going to stand up in the House of Commons and say, you might recall the Didcot disaster in which 4 men died unnecessarily. I can now tell the House, I'm proud to tell the House that we have brought this to conclusion. Do you think anyone's going to do that? No, because nobody gives a toss. It's forgotten. It's forgotten. The only place that Didcot really lives on in anyone's memory is in the families of the 4 guys that were killed, the other men and women that were working at the site on the day, and the wider demolition industry. The rest of the world has moved on. I find that terribly sad, but that is the way it's been allowed to happen. Because, you know, it wouldn't have been hard when that investigation started for somebody to have said, we want this whole thing buttoned up within, let's say, 4 years. 4 years still seems a long while to me, but, you know, we want this whole thing buttoned up, resolved, conclusions drawn, prosecutions, if necessary, taken, but we want it all done in 4 years. And when 4 years and 1 day roll around, it triggers on somebody's computer and they say, you haven't met the target, therefore, A, public inquiry, and B, we need to look more closely at the way in which the Thames Valley Police and the Health and Safety Executive have handled this high-profile case. Instead of which, they were just given free rein, take as long as you like. And what is the expression? you extend the job to fill the time allocated to it. You know, if I give myself a deadline of tomorrow to do a thing, it'll be done by tomorrow. If somebody says, when you get round to it, never going to get done. Never going to get done. 100% HC needs overhaul. It's been a huge letdown of late, as they are missing a lot of areas here. They really are. How do you overhaul an organisation that is in a mindset of its own? Who would take their place? More important, who would they choose? Something like an overhaul needs people who know the industries they are overseeing, not a bunch of people who have only ever read the rule book. I don't know if you remember this. There was some talk, oddly enough, it was pre-Didcot, but there was some talk of a system or a protocol that they refer to as earned autonomy. So, in other words, the health and safety executive would kind of take a bit of a step back and allow industries, not just demolition, although that was what I was concentrating on when I was reporting on it, but they would take a step back and basically allow the industry to police itself. So, you know, they would issue edicts on you need to be aware of dust or vibration or slips and trips or working at height or whatever the current fad was. They would issue edicts on that, and then they would allow, if the industries involved were proving to be sufficiently effective at policing themselves, they would earn that autonomy, and they would allow, I don't know, the NFDC or the IDE or a combination thereof to effectively appoint their own health and safety people, and they would report back on a regular basis. Obviously, it's earned autonomy. So if you have that autonomy and you let the side down, you lose it. Perfectly fine. And then Didcot came along, and frankly, all bets were off after that. Especially since demolition is the thing that supposedly matters the least. It's just removing something you want gone. So if you save money, you will. Nobody will pick the house builder that asks for only half of the other offers. No, you're dead right. You're dead right. There's a whole other thing there with, I don't know if you have the same thing over in Luxembourg, Al, but there is a system, certainly here in the UK construction industry, of retentions. In other words, a main contractor often, or a client, will sit on a portion of money just in case they need some sort of snagging doing, you know. And I think further up the food chain in construction, you can understand that if you ask a company to come in and put in a heating and ventilating system, and they do it and they send you the invoice, let's say their invoice is £100,000 and they pay you £90,000, they sit on the other £90,000 so that when the building is occupied and they flip the switch, if the heating starts, you then get your 10,000 quid. That's the basic idea. But retentions in demolition make no sense whatsoever. As you rightly said, you basically want something gone, or you want a building on the floor. So I'm going to charge you £100,000 to make that building, that bridge, that house, whatever it might be, go away. It's gone away. Can I have my £100,000 back? Well, we'll pay you 90. We'll pay you 90 late, but we'll pay you 90 because, you know, the retention system. So it's a nonsense. Just a thought here. I wonder if intervention fees are in place for Didcot. I would hate to think who is liable for them. I would imagine, and I'm doing this purely on guesswork, I would imagine something of this magnitude. I think, given the time that it's taken, the manpower that's gone into it, the cost of that would outweigh any conceivable fine. So my guess is that it will be a fine and no intervention fee. But I don't know. I dread to think how much money has been put into that. It's a sad situation, but it's true. After a certain time, it becomes forgettable for many, which is very sad. Yeah, it is. It is very sad. And again, I think to a degree, I think the Health and Safety Executive and the Thames Valley Police are using that to their advantage. You know, I think if this was still front page news, you know, if it had been a mass shooting or a mass stabbing, you know, it would remain front page news until the perpetrators were brought to justice. This was, Didcot, oh, how sad. Right, what's next? Philip Schofield's jumped a queue to see the Queen in a coffin. It's forgotten, completely forgotten. Didcot 4, hashtag Didcot 4. Still got my t-shirt, actually. We need to keep talking about this horrible disaster of justice for the four guys and their families. That's all we can do. You know, I said to the guy at the BBC yesterday, I am very famous. Personally, I'm very famous among a very small number of people. I have no wider... I don't actually believe I have a great deal of influence in terms of demolition, but I certainly have no influence outside of demolition. But if nobody else is going to talk about it, you kind of have to take up the mantle yourself, don't you? And I've thought about it. Just to let you know, I wrote... Very quick recap. So I'd read a book by an author, an ex-punk rocker called Henry Rollins. Some of you may remember he was with a band called Black Flag, one of the scariest men you're ever likely to encounter, but a very good author. But he writes regularly for like the New Yorker and the LA Times, and every once in a while he would piece together all of those, or the very best of his work, and put them out as a self-published book. And I remember reading one of those books thinking, what a fantastic idea. And bearing in mind, I produce articles daily, more specifically weekly these days, because I'm concentrating on all things video. What a great idea. I will get round to that one of these days. Didcot happened. And I'm not comparing myself, but, you know, I guess the same mentality. You know, Bob Geldof watched Michael Burke's report from Ethiopia and said, I can't just sit here and not do something. What do I have at my disposal? I have a musical background and I know a lot of people in music. That gave birth to Band-Aid and Live Aid and so on. I had the same thought process. What do I have at my disposal? And all I had at my disposal were words. So I called up Mark Coleman, literally a day or two after Didcot happened. And I said, look, Mark, I've got this idea for a book. And my plan basically is I'll self-publish the book. I'll fund it. And any profits from the book will go to the families of the four men killed. Are you cool with that? And he said, yes. So I pulled together the best of my work. My son pieced it together, made it look vaguely pretty. And we issued it. And we raised a couple of grand. Interestingly, people like the Institute of the European Demolition Association, who had no dog in the fight, they bought hundreds of books. Some of the biggest orders for books came from Coleman Company's rival companies in and around Birmingham. So we raised a couple of grand. I could have left it there, I guess. But I just got the impression that nobody else was doing anything, you know. And I heard on the grapevine, and I don't know, and frankly I don't care if this is true. But this incident took place in February, and the National Federation of Demolition Contractors have their annual general meeting in March. Traditionally in March, and every other year that AGM welcomes a new president. And there was actually a discussion, I'm led to believe there was a discussion in the run-up to the AGM. It was either the one immediately after Didcot came down or the first anniversary. And there was a discussion about whether they should hold a minute's silence or a 4-minute silence. Who cares? Who cares? You know, that's not contributing anything. It's not helping the families. It's not helping the wider knowledge of the demolition industry. It's not actually moving things forward. It's not moving the needle, as people say. All that I can do. I don't want to come across as sounding worthy, but you know, it has, for the last 6.5 years, it has really shaped what I do. All I can do is keep talking about it. And I will tell you this, hand on heart. We self-published the book. We sold all the copies that we published. We then got another lot reprinted. We sold those two. We then got another bunch reprinted, and we sold probably half of them. As I say, profits went to the families, all done and dusted. Went to 3 of the families. One of them didn't want it. They made that very clear, and we were more than happy to oblige. The way that I worked it out was we will take the print cost. We will take the income from that book, take off the print cost, and that will be our profit. But that book cost me thousands. It really did. It took me a couple of weeks of non-stop work to put it together. It took me months and months of promotion. I was paying for delivery of books, and some of those books were going out 100 at a time. So, you know, you're talking 30, 40, 50 quid to get them sent up the country or to overseas locations. It cost me a fortune. I have no regrets about that. You know, I'm not passing around the I'm not going to hand around the hat and expect anybody to contribute to it. But that's what it did. And it did that. You know, listen, I'm an emotional robot. I'm going to do my father's eulogy this week without batting an eyelid, probably, without a trembling lip in the house. That's not really me at all. But there was something about Didcot that just, I don't know whether it was my closeness to Demolition. I don't know whether it was the fact that these were working men, and for all the glamour, who am I kidding? But for all the glamour of what I do for a living, I'm a working guy. I'm a working man. You know, I come from a working class background. Grew up on a council estate. These were my people, and I'm just. The longer it drags on, the more I believe that there is nobody speaking for the families. Dan has just asked, have you got any books left? No. Funnily enough, I kept some in storage. The remainder, a couple of hundred books, actually got damp, and as a result, they don't exist anymore. As a very quick recap, and I don't want to get too far off on this. I'm going to conclude it in a minute because we've been going for more than an hour. That original book was called A Sight for Sore Eyes, SITE, Sight. I thought it was a very clever play on words. Not sure if anybody else got it. But we actually did a Sight for Sore Eyes 2 last year. I pulled together another bunch of and that one wasn't for charity or anything like that. It was just, I had a big bunch of words, had a bit of time to kill, so I pulled together another one. That one is still available, I think, over on our, let me think, I think that's available on buymeacoffee.com/demolition news. So that one's certainly available. Ken Hatcher has said, right, I've got things to do. Yeah, so have I. I've got a run to do today. If, as you think, they want to sweep it under the mat, then I, for one, will never let it drop, and I know you will not. No, I won't. I've not in the way, you always see these police dramas where the police detective says to the grieving widow, don't worry, ma'am, I will pursue this until I bring the person to justice. That's not, I've never had that conversation with anyone at any of the families of the 4 guys that were killed, but I won't. I'm not, I will pursue this till the bitter end. I'd like to think that the thing will be resolved one way or another before I retire. I've got, what have I got? 57 now. I've probably got about another 12 years of doing this old nonsense. I'm sat on the arse. It's not like it's a hard day. So yeah, I've probably got about another 12, 13 years of this left in me. I will go into my retirement a whole lot happier, knowing that I saw it through to the bitter end. We shall see. Many thanks indeed, Dan. Gary. I was looking at Dan's name and reading the comment from Gary. You enjoy the rest of your weekend as well, my friend. Cool. I'll check it out. Have a lovely day, weekend, guys. See you Monday. Stay safe and enjoy. That's a perfect message on which to end an hour and 17 minutes in. The way that I always sign off our daily show, our breakfast show, is stay safe, look after your family, your friends, and your colleagues, and that was basically born out of the fact that we originally started those shows at the height of COVID. But it applies equally to all things Didcot related. So please do look after yourself, look after your family, your friends, and your colleagues. And I'll see you again very, very soon. I'm just going to play that one. Good show, mate. Have a good weekend. Mick, thank you very much indeed. You have a good weekend too, my friend. I'm going to go. I don't know about you people, but I can feel a sausage sarnie coming on. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening to me babble on. As it turns out, I didn't need to record my conversation with the BBC because I remembered most of it. Happy days. See you on Monday. All the best.